Canada is a country built on immigration and multiculturalism. Unlike the United States, which is a melting pot, Canada has chosen to embrace the cultures that come into the fabric of the country. When we think of immigration to Canada, the early 20th century immigration of Europeans tends to stand out, but there has been another immigration that happened at the same time: Muslim immigration. It was slower and smaller than the European immigration, but those who came became a part of the fabric of our history and benefited our country in many ways. Let's dive into the topic of Islam and Muslims throughout Canadian history. The generally accepted first Muslims in Canada are believed to be James and Agnes Love, two Scottish immigrants who had converted to Islam in their native country. Arriving in Canada in 1851, their child, James Love Jr., was born in 1854 and has the distinction of being the first Muslim born in what would one day be Canada. The family would attain another first 14 years later when their son Alexander was born, making him the first Muslim born in Canada as we know it. From that first Muslim family, a slow migration began. By 1871, there were 13 Muslims living in Canada, and over the next 3 decades that number would rise, only slightly, to 47. Things began to change at the turn of the century, and the Muslim migration picked up, with a few hiccups along the way. Before we get too far ahead, let's look at Big Sam, a Lebanese immigrant whose family would have a long and powerful impact on Alberta. Now going forward, I would like to apologize if I mispronounce any names. Big Sam, or Salim Shahib, was born in Lebanon in 1880 and made his way to America in 1903. Spending 4 years in the United States, he returned to Lebanon in 1907 and married his wife Fatima and had a son. Returning to the United States a few years later to settle and prepare things for his family, he would soon migrate to Canada and begin working on a homestead near Brooks, Alberta. In 1925, Big Sam moved to Endaig and opened up a store. Once settled there, he sent for his wife and son, and they arrived, 12 years after he had initially left Lebanon. His son Albert began to learn the trade of the store business, and in 1930, after his own marriage, he started a store in Bymore. The store would be successful, and 15 years later, Albert moved his family to Edmonton. His business continued to grow, and in 1949, Albert started a successful wholesale distribution company. He would continue to work at his business and build its success until his unfortunate death in 1963. Now his son Larry would move his own family from Edmonton to the northern Alberta community of High Prairie. Once there, he began to establish himself in the community, and in 1975, Larry Shabin was elected as an MLA to the Alberta legislature, making him one of the first Muslims to be elected to higher office in North America. He would serve his northern constituents from 1975 to 1989, which included surviving a plane crash in 1984 that killed MLA Grant Notley, the father of current Premier Rachel Notley. Larry was instrumental in establishing the Edmonton Islamic Academy, and when he passed in 2008, 1,000 people, including 3 former Alberta premiers, attended his funeral. So back to Muslim migration. Things picked up through the early 1910s, and there were reported to be 500 Muslims living in British Columbia alone. Unfortunately, due to the Turks being involved on the opposite side of the First World War from Canada, many Muslims were pressured to leave, and in 1921, only 82 were left in the province. That was unfortunate, because Muslims were among the many Canadian troops who went overseas to fight in the First World War. In total, 22 Muslims fought for Canada, which actually represents a decent percentage of the Muslims in Canada at the time. One such Muslim was Private Hassan Hamat, who was born in Singapore in 1894 and worked as a seaman before arriving in Canada. On January 14, 1916, he enlisted in New Brunswick, and this was after he was deemed unfit to serve in Ontario. Deployed to France with the 1st Canadian Infantry Battalion, Amat contracted influenza 3 times, but was still able to fight at Vimy Ridge. He would lose his life on August 20th, 1917, at the Battle of Hill 70. He is the only Canadian Muslim to die in the First World War. It was in the 1910s that 2 other Muslims would begin to make names for themselves in Canada. The first was Hussein Rahim, who was identified as both Hindu and a Muslim. Born in 1865 in Delhi, he would learn to speak several languages and become fluent in English. Coming to Vancouver in the 20th century, he was a member of the Shore Committee, who took over the charter of the Komagata Maru when it arrived in 1914. That ship carried 376 passengers from India, who unsuccessfully tried to immigrate to Canada. The passengers were all denied entry into Canada under racist pretenses, and the ship was sent back to India, where several passengers were killed in an incident with police. Canada would eventually issue a formal apology for the incident 100 years later. As for Rahim, he fought on behalf of the passengers while also putting out an English newspaper that same year. In 1937, he passed away in Vancouver. Another Muslim named Ali Abu Shadi would have an immense impact on Islam in the Alberta community of Lac La Biche. Born in 1892 in what would one day be Lebanon, Ali came to Canada with his uncle in 1905 after hearing about the Klondike Gold Rush. Spending $24 for passage to Canada on a ship out of Beirut, Ali was sick for most of the journey. To add further disappointment, he found out upon arriving in Canada that the gold rush had actually finished several years previous. Making his way to Winnipeg with his uncle, he began to peddle fans for 10 cents each. Later that same year, in 1905, he again moved with his uncle to Edmonton. 1 year later, they both found their way to Lac La Biche, a community to the north of the Alberta capital. In 1909, his uncle Hussein decided to go back to Lebanon, leaving the 17-year-old Ali to fend for himself. Undaunted, Ali began to work the store into a success, and he was able to develop a lasting and positive relationship with the local indigenous people, to the point he was able to learn Cree. In 1912, to help assimilate into the Canadian culture further, he changed his name to Alexander Hamilton. Over the coming years, Ali helped many Muslims come to Canada and put down roots. In addition, he helped with the construction of the Northern Alberta Railway and was the local Ford Motor Company agent. He also set up the first grain harvester in Lac La Biche. In 1919, a fire tore through Lac La Biche and destroyed his store in the process. Nonetheless, he built a bigger store, and after the Hudson's Bay Company left the region, his business began to flourish. This didn't make the Hudson's Bay Company happy, and they unsuccessfully lobbied the Alberta government to shut down his business. His success in Lac La Biche helped bring more Muslims to the community, something we will touch on later. After several successful years in the community, he moved to Edmonton and operated a real estate business. Over the coming years, he would go back to Lebanon twice to visit family, and he would pass away on December 10, 1985. Today, a park and a pond outside Lac La Biche are named Alexander Hamilton in his honor. When asked about his decision to come to Canada so many years ago, he always said, "I am proud of being Canadian." Ali's journey mirrored that of Esmail Jamha, another man who came to Canada as a teenager and became a successful trader. Arriving in Canada in 1907, he began a fur trade with the First Nations and set up a strong relationship with them. He was known to live with the indigenous people of the area and even learn to sing with them in their language. Elsewhere in Canada, Muslims worked to build up the country they were now calling home. Many helped to lay tracks of the Canadian Pacific Railway, while others built grain elevators, and more helped in sawmills to build towns and homes. Mary Sadi, a Muslim woman in southern Alberta, helped her family's ranch prosper, and in turn helped the entire area prosper. Following the war, Muslim immigration once again picked up. In 1921, there were 478 Muslims, and 10 years later, 645. In those years, another Muslim family arrived and would gain some fame over the years. Saeed Amin Ghanam arrived with his wife and 3 children in 1926 and began living in Admiral, Saskatchewan. 3 years later, the family moved to Regina and began running a grocery store in the capital city of the province. While Saeed died in 1971, it was his son Amin Ghanam who achieved fame across the continent. After his father ordered him a fiddle from the Eaton's catalog when Amin was only 5, it set the child on a career path that would have him become the King of Fiddling in Canada. By the 1950s, Amin was playing the fiddle across the country and even had his own show on CBC from 1954 to 1955. In 1962, he moved to California and played on the Tommy Hunter Show, many times under the name King Ghanam. By the time Amin passed in 1994, he was inducted into the Canadian Country Music Hall of Fame. As for Muslim immigration, it would explode between 1931 and 1971. While there were 645 Muslims in Canada in 1931, there would be 33,430 by 1971. The big reasons for this were the baby boom of the 1940s and changes Canada made to its immigration policies in the 1950s. This then allowed the door to open for Muslims in greater numbers to come to Canada. It was also during those 4 decades that major changes came for the Muslim community in Canada. In 1934, the first Muslim organization was organized in Regina. 4 years later, the first mosque in Canada and the second in North America opened in Edmonton. The Al Rashid Mosque was built not only thanks to Muslims coming together, but many other nationalities and religions as well. The process towards the mosque began in the 1920s when the Muslim community of Alberta began thinking of having a place they would be able to gather to pray. The move towards the mosque was led by Muslim woman Hilwi Hamdan, who approached then Mayor John Fry about the mosque. Plans were drawn up by a Ukrainian Albertan architect, and shopkeepers along Jasper Ave helped to raise money for the building. In addition, dances, teas, dinners, and card games were organized by Muslim women, who were the real leaders in getting the mosque built. Christian and Jewish Albertans also contributed to building the religious center. Eventually, $5,000 was raised for the building. The mosque was inaugurated on December 12, 1938, by Abdullah Yusuf Ali, the translator of the Quran to English. Now, we'll look at our next Muslim citizen who worked to help the country that they had adopted. Peter Baker, who was born Baon Ferran, was born in 1887 in what would be Lebanon, and after emigrating to the country at the turn of the 20th century, he began working as a trapper in Alberta. Developing a strong relationship with the indigenous people, he would eventually move to the Northwest Territories, where he was elected as an MLA in 1964, serving until 1967. He passed away in 1973. In 1955, the first mosque would open in Ontario, thanks to the efforts of several Lebanese families. That same year, Lac La Biche, which had a growing Muslim population thanks to the work of Ali Abu Shadi, would build a mosque, the second in Alberta. Built by the Arabian Muslim Association and through volunteer labor, it was used as a speaker's hall and Arab Muslim primary school in the community. It would take several years to completely finish the mosque, with all work completed in 1970. By that point, 10% of Lac La Biche's population identified as Muslim, the highest percentage for a community in North America at the time. From 1971 onwards, the Muslim population continued to grow. In 1981, nearly 100,000 Muslims called Canada home, and 10 years later that had doubled to 253,265. Numbers continued to rise to 2001 when 579,000 Muslims were living in Canada, and by 2013, over 1 million Muslims lived here. Over the years from 1971 to the present, there would be several more changes for the Muslim community of Canada. The first mosque in Toronto would open in 1973, and the first Islamic seminary, or madrasa, in North America opened in Cornwall in 1983, and the first mosque would open in the Arctic in 2010. Since those early beginnings, Muslims have shaped and improved Canada with their culture. Islam is now the fastest growing religion in Canada, and English, French, and Arabic are the 3 most common languages spoken in places like the Northwest Territories. Muslims have adopted Canada as their home, and studies have shown just how happy they are here. In an Environics survey in 2016, 83% of Muslims said they were proud of being Canadian, 10% higher than the non-Muslims who were asked the same question. In addition, 94% of Canadian Muslims reported a strong or very strong sense of belonging in Canada. In recent years, many Muslims have helped put Canada on the map in many ways. Maryam Mansef became the first Muslim cabinet minister, while Naheed Nenshi is the first Muslim mayor of a North American city. In addition, Yasmin Rantansi would be the first female Muslim MP. From the first 3 Muslims to the 1.2 million living in Canada today, it has been a long and interesting journey for Muslims throughout Canadian history. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Canadian History X, and if you did, please give a like and a share. You can reach me with any questions and suggestions at crwbaird@gmail.com or through Twitter at craigbaiard. You can also find me on Instagram at bairdo37. Thanks again for joining me on a Canadian history journey, and I hope to see you next time.